I'm Brett Myers. I've been attending Protospiel since like 2002, 2003, somewhere around there. I always consider myself kind of like accidentally published. I never really considered even pitching games. I was just coming to Protospiel because I like to design games and it was really fun and it was a thing that my friends did. My first published game was kind of accidentally discovered at a Protospiel back in 2008 or so. It was after hours and we were playing all the weird stuff. And I brought out a game that had never been tested before. My design partner and I had come up with this idea that we wanted to play, and I put it on the table, and the group was having a lot of fun. It was loud, it was raucous, and Phil from Steve Jackson Games, Phil Reed from Steve Jackson Games happened to be at a table a couple rows away, and he overheard us playing, and he came over, he's like, "Hey, what's this?" I'm like, "Oh, it's just this weird thing I came up with." He's like, "Will you run it for me?" I'm like, "Sure." We played it again, he liked it. He's like, "Let's play that again." I'm like, "Okay." We played it again, and he's like, "What do you plan on doing with this?" I'm like, "I don't know, I never thought of that." So he's like, "Well, why don't you send it with me, and we'll see what we can do." And like a couple weeks later, I had a contract for publishing from Steve Jackson Games, and a year after that, the game was published, and then I kind of got the fever for publishing, and so I've had 5 games published now over the years, a couple from Steve Jackson, one from WizKids. I've had a game with R&R Games, and most recently I had Dual Powers with Thunderworks Games here in Madison, and I've got a game coming sometime with Restoration Games. I'm working on the restoration of Thunder Road for them, which was launched initially in October, but then they pulled back that Kickstarter, and they're going to be relaunching in January, last I heard. So that's my short experience.
All right, all right. Can you guys hear us okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little louder.
Okay. All right, I'm Nick Bentley. I've been working in the board game industry since 2014. From 2014 through 2019, I worked for North Star Games, doing a variety of things, but one thing I did the whole time was take pitches from designers. So I've thought endlessly about how to make the relationship between designer and publisher good. I think it's, for many publishers and designers, dysfunctional. So that's something we can talk about, trying to find ways of fixing that. I ended my tenure there as the head of online marketing. I also did development and design work. I'm one of the designers, for example, on Evolution Oceans from North Star Games. And then I got hired by another company called Underdog Games, which is a new company, but a company that's growing very quickly because it has a really unusual business model. Everything cool? We good? All right. It has a really unusual business model. They don't sell games into distribution like almost every other publisher. They sell games directly to customers, mostly through Amazon, which means the profit margins on the games are like 4 to 5 times what they are for most publishers. And as a result of that, that's allowed us to grow incredibly quickly. We've grown more than 100% a year every year of our existence. So I think last year we're up to $6.5 million in revenue, and we were founded 3 years ago. And so there, I'm the head of the game design studio, so I help decide what projects we're going to work on and help guide them through. I do help on design and development as well. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. We've been told this is sort of a question and answer thing, but I'm happy to just talk at length about my views on things. Love the sound of my own voice. So yeah. Any subjects you guys want to talk about?
Everybody still here okay? I can slide the microphone around too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll just say, I could use some help on where to begin, on how, I know some people do meetups at conventions, can't get to every convention.
Yeah, yeah.
I have sent out emails, and I've actually been surprised at, actually getting responses, but I just don't really know how to begin when I have something ready to pitch.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually am not. What I'm about to say is idiosyncratic, and other publishers will disagree with me. I think you should avoid pitching games at conventions, and the reason is that the convention is a very noisy space where the publisher has 1,000 people coming at them with 1,000 pitches, and it is very hard to like generate the right mindset for being really mindful about interacting with the designer and really understanding how their game could be great, you know. So it's kind of like a buyer's market, I guess you'd say, as well. There's so many people pitching things. I would try to avoid that. Now, you alluded to sending emails. You said you were getting responses.
I was. The one game that I was pitching was probably just too big and too niche, but now I have one that's far more broad marketed, and so I've been kind of waiting, right? Because I don't want to blow it this time because this one has legs.
Right, okay, yeah. Okay, so the first thing I would say is that craft your email to the publisher with as much care as you designed the game in the first place. Like, draft it and redraft it, and try to make a really good, substantiated case that this could be a hit. Now, the way that you substantiate that something could be a hit is different for every game, so I can't like give you really specific advice, you know. But like, you know, so if you have, when you're playtesting, you collect comments from people, and you get a bunch of like wow comments, you know, record them and share them. Say, these are some unsolicited comments that I got from playtesters, and like, you know, so this gives you an idea. I would also say don't go into the mechanics very much. Like, the publisher has to playtest to decide for themselves whether they think the game is good. And so that's kind of what playtesting is for. You know, a high level, you know, one-liner like that. Especially if you have a mechanic that itself can act as sort of like marketing for the game, that'll make people like wake up and be like, oh, that's cool. My experience though is that we designers tend to think that the things we've done are more original than they actually are. So, you know, 4,000 games are published every year. I think that roughly translates to something like 200,000 pitches every year. From the publisher's point of view, it feels like a tidal wave, right? Like, I feel like I've heard everything before, and it's really hard for me to like to see something really unique, you know? Sometimes that's a failure on my part to understand. Sometimes that's a failure on the designer's part to pitch in the right way, but communication about these things is really, really hard. My greatest embarrassment in all of this is Elizabeth Hargrave pitched North Star Games Wingspan. And like, it hurts, man. It still stings to this day. So, but it's because I had this tidal wave coming at me, and what happened, like, she was a first-time designer, right? And so like, first-time designers, you tend to just, like 99.9% of the games pitched by first-time designers are not good, right? So I tend to just like, at that time I was just like, I just tuned her out too much, and it was stupid, right? But it's like, separating signal from noise is a very difficult problem. I mean, anything you can do to help the publisher separate signal from noise, we will be grateful for, you know? So yeah. Is that too much, too little? Any follow-up questions? Okay.
So if convention pitches are not great, what would you suggest as alternatives?
Yeah, actually, so I'd like to propose something sort of unconventional, which is that don't start your relationship with the publisher with a pitch of your game. Start, if you can, with trying to understand what they're trying to do in publishing and who their customers are. So, like, one way you could do this is, instead of writing a pitch email, write an email asking some questions about who their audience is and how the publisher thinks they can make the audience happy with the games they publish. I would be, I'm certainly interested in that. The danger of that is you don't want publishers to feel like their time is being wasted, right? You have to honor their time, and it can be difficult to do that with these questions. So I would also say keep all of your emails very short and extremely to the point, but powerful at the same time. So It's like a haiku, even though it's very short, draft and redraft until it really, like that few sentences punches you in the face, you know? Yeah, that's what I would say. Yes, in the back.
Yes. I certainly, and I think a lot of the information about how to contact a publisher and all that information, super valid and all that. I wanted to, since it's just the first two messages, there's some questions a bit about this, I wanted to just provide a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I want to emphasize as well that what I'm saying is idiosyncratic, so hopefully you will present the less idiosyncratic view.
For those of you who haven't met, my name is Alex Agram, COO of Legal Games here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And on the convention side of pitching, understand that for a lot of small publishers, the situation that is described there is absolutely correct. They're a 1 or 2 person operation. They're trying to do sales. They're trying to operate their booth. They have other meetings that they need to try and take, and it is a very distracted environment to have a pitch meeting in, to try to really, switch gears and focus on this, especially if you're trying to take that meeting, in a noisy booth or whatever. Also understand that larger companies, such as Amigo, explicitly have staff and space set aside for those pitch meetings. So, for example, at Essen, there was a team of 4 people that had a large room that was isolated, that was quiet, and their job was to exclusively focus on designer meetings. So, be aware that if a publisher gives you the opportunity to have a meeting at a convention, obviously your experience will vary based on the size of the publisher and what they're offering. But you're going to find publishers that have taken the time to find a place that is quieter, a place that they can focus, some time set aside where they are in a mindset to pay attention to you, to be mindful of your pitches. So I think the greater question is, the greater thing to keep in mind here is that if a publisher is willing to give you their time for a pitch meeting, convention or otherwise, take it. Take advantage of that opportunity. Even if it is not the best experience for purposes of the pitch, it still puts you and your designs in front of somebody, you've met them, and now it's much easier to have that offline conversation, video pitch, they're more willing to open and take time to look at your stuff if you're a known entity. So again, I think there's a lot to be taken away from the fact that there's a lot of value in non-convention pitches, especially if a lot of companies have opportunities now to be able to pitch by to submit a video, and a lot of those things are really good tools to be able to look at stuff. When you're in that mindset of I'm willing to pay attention, I'm ready to really focus on what a designer is offering. But if there is an opportunity at convention, don't be afraid to take it. It may not be the ideal, but in some cases it will be. So it will be a situation where you really have a publisher that has taken the time to craft an experience that's going to be valuable for both of you.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. I mean, one thing that's sort of a subtext here is that publishers are very different in the way they do things. And we don't advertise the differences very outwardly that much, which can make it really you could pitch in one way to one publisher and it works great for them, and you could pitch in the exact same way to another publisher and it's not great for them, based on a whole bunch of internal stuff that you probably don't understand. I guess that's another recommendation for really trying to understand the company and its needs before just sort of barreling in. Yeah. Yes?
What's a good digital pitch strategy? Do I want to try to play my game via Tabletop Simulator or Tabletopia, or do I want to discuss things over Discord?
Oh, yeah. My philosophy is that making a play test as easy and as frictionless as possible is a help, right? So if the part of the pitch is, hey, here's the game on Tabletop Simulator, you can play at any time, just go for it. That's great because it means I can literally just click over, and if I have somebody like in the office who's willing to do a play test, I can do it right there, right? Which is great. There's not the more planning I as the publisher have to do to make a play test happen, the less likely that's going to happen because I got a bunch of other stuff I got to do, right? Other stuff? Yes?
Can you maybe just walk us through like what, I know this is different for every publisher, but like what you might expect from like your average pitch meeting?
Yeah, I mean, the average pitch meeting, I actually also, the whole time I've been in the industry, I also like pitch games to others to understand what it's like from the other side. And typically the experience is you pitch the game, the publisher will go, be fairly non-committal, say, I'll get back to you, and they may or may not get back to you. That's the initial contact. A lot of times they don't get back to you, right? To Alex's point, there are companies that are committed to making the system of soliciting games efficient because that's like a central part of their strategy. And there are other companies for whom it's not a central part of their strategy. Both of the companies that I've worked for did a lot of internal stuff, and so there was a sort of competition for attention between the internal stuff and the external stuff, and we probably didn't have, our systems were not as good as they were, like at Alex's company probably, because we had these conflicting things. So, I mean, maybe that's one thing to look at. Like, if it looks like a company is publishing most of the stuff via internal projects, like, don't maybe invest as much of your time into those as the companies that seem like truly designed for outside solicitation, I would say. Another sort of related point is, just as a point of strategy, so publishers have like sort of there's like a spectrum of strategies, publication strategies. On one end of the spectrum is publish 1 million games and see what sticks. On the other end of the spectrum is publish like 1 game a year and put everything you have into it. There are risks and rewards for doing both of those things, but from the designer point of view, like if you can, and it's harder to do it, but if you can get with the publisher that has the very narrow publication strategy, you'll have more of their resources committed to your project than you do if you go with the see what sticks strategy. Yeah.
See what sticks tends to be about 2 weeks of promotion, then it's on to the next game.
Yeah.
So what happens, I guess, just like post-pitch, if they like, how do you approach designers once you decide that you modify their game and want to work with them?
So yeah, we'll typically set up a meeting. So I typically I don't call them back until I'm sure whether it's a hard yes or a hard no, so I don't waste their time, right? I don't like being in like the gray middle, like, well, maybe, So usually when I've done it, it's been, hey, we're going to publish a game. We'd like to offer you a contract. We'd like to do this kind of development on it. Are you okay with that? And if they say yes, then we go ahead. I like to involve the designers who want to be involved from beginning to end. I find that the designers who seem to be most skilled at what they do want to do that, so it's something I try to offer. Yeah, it's pretty simple, but the vast majority of the time, the email is just no, which is, I think, one of the problems. Like, time for me is the ultimate resource. In fact, it's the only resource because every other resource flows from the way that we use our time. And I feel like both the designers and the publishers spend a lot of time in no relationships, right? We're saying no constantly, the designer's pitching constantly and getting rejected, and I want to find, I don't have a solution, but I want to find a better way to do it. My own company actually isn't taking any outside pitches at all right now because I don't like that aspect of outside solicitation. Yes?
From a designer point of view, I mean, it's great, someone's interested, yay. But now, from the designer who's pitching point of view, what should they look for to know that they're going to be happy with the relationship with the publisher? Because it's flattering a publisher wants your game, this may be review.
Yeah.
Maybe it's flattering a publisher wants your game, doesn't mean someone else might not, and it doesn't mean that they're going to treat it like the baby it is to you.
Right. Yeah. So the first and foremost, I reiterate what I said earlier, which is try to find a publisher that has a narrow publication strategy. So if I'm only publishing one game a year, I have to make that game good, because if I don't, the company's going to sink. That's the big risk of a narrow publication strategy. So you know that if you're publishing with one of those companies, they're going to pour themselves into it. The other thing I would do is up front talk about how, set expectations about how you're going to communicate, what will be communicated, and what your involvement will be. A number of designers often tell me that one of their biggest pet peeves is you'll get down to near to the time when the game has to go to the printer, and the publisher will make some large change in the gameplay or in the presentation of the game without consulting the designer, who often has some detailed understanding of the architecture of the game that the publisher may not fully have, especially if the designer is very good, and that people get designers get really disappointed when that happens. It can really hurt. So I'm very wary of this, and I try to make the communication incredibly good, especially at the end there. But try to set those expectations up front. And that doesn't guarantee that they're actually going to honor those expectations, because when it comes down to crazy go to the printer time, people can become less mindful of their relationships with others. But yeah, okay, I think that's what I'd say. Yeah.
Aspects of that relationship can be defined in the contract as well.
Yeah.
That's true.
So
Should
for
be.
example, the old daycare contract, designers had a 10-day window when we were ready to go to press. You would receive all the pre-press PDFs, so that if there had anything, oftentimes, as you say, a company should have that relationship to talk to you throughout. But there was that one window that if it was something that fell through the cracks, something change we made, we hadn't communicated, there was this window contractually that you got to see the rule book, you got to see the component printouts, you got to see all that information, and at least put a go-no-go on. You had that opportunity to say, at least understand why a change may have been made, and if there was something significantly an issue there was at least a chance to understand how to move that relationship forward from that point. So, again, as a designer, don't be afraid when you're offered that contract to include things like, I would like to have a final review pre-publication. I would like to have, a communication, a schedule.
Yeah.
Set those expectations, but they can also be set contractually as well as an agreement between people. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a variety of experiences with that post contract. My first game was Steve Jackson Games. Steve Jackson is a very successful publisher. They know what they're doing. They know their fans. They know their audience. The game that I signed initially with them, like I had said before, it was basically first play test. It was a very rough game. Phil liked it. I had a contract in 2 weeks, and then it went into heavy development internally in Steve Jackson's for an entire year. And the game that was published was pretty significantly different than the game I handed off, because the game I handed off was pretty raw, right? It barely had rules written. And they went into a whole year of internal development before that game came out. It was still our game, but it was significantly different. They kept us updated along this process of, here's the things we're trying now. How do you think what do you think about that? Sounds good to us. Yeah. Here's the thing we're trying now. What do you think about this? And so they had kind of a back and forth between myself and my other designer and their internal development crew. It was always fairly clear along that path that they were going to develop it to what they needed it to be. They wanted our feedback and encouragement and stuff. It was very clearly once I signed that contract, it was going to be their game and was going to be published in a format that they wanted it to be, essentially. And I was okay with that. It's obviously it was my first game, and I was just excited to be signed. And I don't have any problem with the game that came out. It's a great game. But I've also had kind of the opposite experiences with other publishers, where some publishers, especially smaller publishers, want you to do all the development yourself. You need to either hand in a very complete game or have something that is nearly complete. They'll give you a little bit of feedback, but you're going to be doing all that final work. I've done that with several publishers where pitch them a game, they like it, we sign it, and it comes back to me, they say, hey, we like this game, can you change this, can you change this, can you change this? Okay, we do some work, and then I put in more months of design and development work on my own game to get that to the final published state, which is, I don't know which I like best. I mean, I like having that control of my game, but also, you know, once I've designed it, I don't mind just handing it off and let somebody else do all the extra work, because I want to design the next game. Yeah, so it kind of, where I'm going with that is, I guess it depends on the publisher what they are going to expect from you, and it's hard to necessarily suss that out pre-contract, I guess. once you maybe during that pitch or during that, you know, early negotiations, that is something that you maybe would want to talk to a publisher about, like what are the expectations going forward? Am I going to be involved in a necessary component of the development of this game for the next 6 months until it's published, or is this something that you guys are going to handle and I'm done with it, or, you know, that's what my experiences have been.
So when you sign that contract, are you giving them creative control over your game? Will you ever get it back?
It depends. So most contracts have like a reversion. If it goes out of print for X number of years, it will come back to you.
Okay.
With Steve Jackson games, the way they structure their contracts, it's kind of, they own the game in perpetuity. So my first game with them, it's going to be theirs forever unless they give it back to me for some reason.
All right. And on the business end of that, so they pay you up front for that contract, or you get like any kind of royalties or anything?
I get royalties on those, yeah. So even though they own the game, I still get royalties for any units sold.
You can also do a thing that I've seen that we've done in a couple of our contracts where the game reverts to you if the sales go below a certain threshold, which is good because that's about commitment of the publisher to keep the thing going, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think that makes for a good relationship because it aligns interests.
That is, speaking of publishers and promotional stuff, that is something that you'll find with many publishers, especially smaller publishers, that once, especially if you have any sort of social media presence or anything like that, once you've signed the game, you are also now responsible for promoting your game and promoting yourself, which 'cause most small publishers don't have marketing budgets. They have one guy on a computer, right? And so, you know, you are kind of not officially, but kind of unofficially on the hook for doing promotion, playing your game, bringing it to cons, showing it off to people yourself. And it's, you know, if you don't do that, then your game's not getting out there. If you do that, that's a lot of extra work you're doing that's not getting necessarily directly reimbursed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, and that's actually one thing that you can mention early on, like even in the pitch. If you have ways of getting your game out into the world, make that part of the pitch as well. Like a small publisher will appreciate that. Big publishers with like real marketing budgets probably like meh, but there's a lot of small publishers in the world, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Brett, I'm not sure if you've had many games actually revert back to you yet, but interestingly, when a game reverts back to you, has it been your experience, certainly working with those companies, that you receive back the game as published for you to be able to move out there?
I have not had anything revert back to me yet, and that's a really good question. I will have to look into that.
I can speak to the way we do it, which is that it's the game mechanics that revert back, not any of the assets that we, as the publisher, built on top of that.
And that's importantly in that thing, that means that if a company does develop and work on your game and it is published in a format, you know, depending on what those mechanisms are, you get that work the design you submitted, it's the published design that comes back to you. It's something that's a very weird gray area that's not often defined.
Yeah.
But it's, as a designer, be aware that if you get the design back, have that conversation if there's any question about it. But typically, the game as published is what you have in your possession now.
Yeah.
And that's a nice tool to be able to take around to the next publisher and say, hey, this is a tested design, this is a published design, as opposed to having to revert back to something that was, previous to that. It's your chance to make changes and tweaks, of course, if you want to pitch it differently. But typically, when a game reverts, you're getting back the published design, not the submitted design.
Yeah.
Interesting.
One sort of follow-up point to that is if you get a game back to you and you take it out and pitch it again, part of the pitch has to be, why is it not going to go out of print this time? So, like making changes that you think represent not just minor but significant improvements, and communicating that to the publisher can be valuable in that circumstance.
Well, in the current area, it might just be that the publisher went out of business.
Yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of reasons. But yeah, that is something a publisher has to think about and analyze. If you can say the reason it went out of print was because the publisher died, well, great. That's a fine argument that it wasn't your game's fault.
I got a question for you.
Oh, yeah.
How do you guys feel about sell sheets? I know sell sheets are kind of a common buzz thing in game design.
I'm pro sell sheet, I think. Especially the ones that are really well constructed, because now I have a record of the thing that's really easy to digest, and it keeps it it's easier to keep it in my mind and to remember all the other stuff that's not on the sheet. I like that. Yeah, I like sell sheets. Yes.
Just going off of that, is that something that you would welcome at an early stage of email as kind of an introduction to the pitch, or is that something that you kind of anticipate a little bit later once a connection or relationship has been made?
I think I welcome it as part of the early communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would to expand on that. I think when I was talking about sell sheets, I'm talking about selling a game to the publisher. Right? I make a sheet. Maybe it's an infographic, whatever. This is the game. Here's the fun stuff it does. Here's why it's going to be awesome for you guys. Here's why it's going to sell 1 million copies. Boom. I mean, I'm not. For a sell sheet, I don't think I really want to even think about the customers, just the publisher on that kind of sell sheet. I may be wrong, because I haven't made a sell sheet yet. So.
Yeah, I was hoping you could kind of expand on that a little bit more. What is important to see on a sell sheet, but also what is important not to include?
Yeah, so the most important thing I would say not to include is to go too deeply into the mechanics. I think this is just a common mistake, not just in sell sheets, but everywhere. The designer sits down, the designer's been thinking about the mechanics of this game for, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, and they just immediately launch into the mechanics of the game. And I think that's less important than stuff that will help the publisher understand how the game will be perceived by others, especially on first contact. Because in a world awash in games, you have a second to turn somebody on to the idea of even looking into a game. And so as the publisher, the sell sheet is kind of like that experience for me, designed for me. So if I read the sell sheet and I can put myself in the position of the customer getting a high-level pitch of what this game is, and it hits me, that's awesome. And that typically does not involve mechanics, unless there's some really extraordinary, unusual mechanic that's easy to communicate in a small number of words or a picture, So things like theme have a lot to do with this. I think sometimes we underestimate how powerful theme can be in selling a game. So, Underdog Games is the company I work for now is a really good example of this. We have this one game called Trekking the National Parks. Like a lot of publishers, most publishers have a catalog, but the best-selling games in the catalog account for most of the revenue of the company. And that is true for us. And it's this game called Trekking the National Parks. It's a very simple gateway game. It's the best way I can describe it is sort of a combination of Ticket to Ride and Century Spice Road. There's not much original about it. If you guys in the room would play it, you'd probably say, it's all right, you know. But there's a huge number of people in this world who either think of themselves as national parks people or who aspire to be a national parks kind of person. And that connection that they have allows us to sell insane numbers of copies of this game. So yeah, thinking in themes in terms of the identities that people have. Like we were talking about Elizabeth Hargrave before. I think the core reason that Wingspan distinguished itself so much from other games was that it turns out that there is like an identity group of bird lovers and a large group of aspirational bird lovers that most of us in our world weren't really aware of or tuned into, and it took sort of an outsider to know that and bring it into our world, right? And I'm sure that there are other things like that waiting to be discovered, but you kind of have to go beyond. You really have to think hard about themes, identities, and the way that people relate to those things.
What are some good maybe a list of questions to ask yourself when you are considering that game is done enough to start pitching?
Yeah.
How do you know it's done enough for that?
Yeah.
What are some good metrics?
So there's a couple of things that I do. First, there's a heuristic that Emerson Matsushita, the Century Spice Road guy, that he uses that I really like, which is that until you get spontaneous exclamations of wow while you're playtesting, it's not done. That's a really hard thing to do. And the reason this heuristic is good is because there's something like 200,000 games pitched every year, and the only way to get like breathing room is to make something that's kind of extraordinary in this environment, and that's just the way it is. So I love that heuristic. I think I know I've done this for myself as well, and I know a lot of other designers who would say the same thing. We lie to ourselves about how good our games are. Even the very best designers in the world miss more than they hit. And so, really trying to cultivate your own humility with respect to what you're doing, I think is really important in order to judge whether or not something you've been working on is done. And the final thing I'll say is this thing that I do a lot. I do split testing. So I will take something we're working on, and I'll take a prototype version of a game that is like a major hit, or something that I think is really great. So they're sort of controlled for the quality of the components. And then I'll have some playtesters who have played neither game, play them back to back, and then do sort of a compare and contrast afterward. That's an eye-opener. Most of the time, the thing you're working on is going to lose, and it's going to lose badly. And that's a way to cultivate your own humility about what you have to do to make something that's that good, right?
Thank you.
So, I have a game that I kickstarted. It was a super small Kickstarter, and it funded, and I was happy. And I imagine that some people in the room probably have self-published games before. Should we still be pushing those to publishers, or once it's been pushed out there in a manner that's not the traditional manner, should we just ignore it and say, like, well, that was a fun experience?
Oh, no, I think there are plenty of publishers who are interested in, if you've done a Kickstarter, you have now a commercial track record for that thing. You can see how at least one set of customers interacted with that thing. That's actually really great for a publisher to see. It also shows that the designer has a real level of commitment to it, right? Like there's an incentive mismatch between designer and publisher. So the designer's goal is to get as many games licensed as possible in many cases. The publisher's goal is to find the one game that's going to be a big hit and support the company. For the designer, it means sometimes not going all in on one thing, whereas the publisher, or at least publishers who want to go all in on things, which is generally, I'm on that. Every company I've worked at is on that end of the spectrum. we need that sign of commitment, like, oh, this person cares, maybe there's something here. It's not just, oh, here's another pitch. You know.
So for example, Phil Walker Harding self-published Sushi Go before he licensed it to Game Right.
Yeah.
So that became, Sushi Go.
Yeah. In the back?
So if you're working on a game and you think it's a really strong fit for an IP that a publisher has, but that you could also make the game, adjust the theme so it's not based on that IP, when pitching to that publisher, would you suggest pitching the more generic version or pitching the version that is particularly catered towards their IP?
Yeah, I'm out of my depth here because the companies I've worked at never do IP. He's probably not out of his depth, so you can.
Perhaps you could generalize that question up to a brand. Instead of a particular intellectual property, if a company is producing a series of games that suit themselves as a brand, should you be designing to that brand or cold pitch?
I can only answer for myself. I want Alex to give his answer in a second here. For myself, yes. If you're pitching specifically to a brand, it suggests to me that you have thought about who our audience is and you care about that, right? So I'm interested in hearing what you might pitch with specifically for a brand. What were you going to say, Alex?
So I can give you an example, an actual produce field example. There's a designer named David Witcher who came to a produce field, kind of ran up to me, as it were, and said, "I got a game I want you to look at." And it was pitched as kind of a 17th century. You were a crew of a ship, and you were, one of you was the cannon guy, one of you was the sales guy, and it was, it was a dice game, so you were rolling dice to kind of work, basically cooperative, get your ship, keep your ship together, get as much, plunder as you could. And we played it, and I thought, this is nice, I like this game a lot. And he said, after we did the play test, and I'd had my opinions about the game, he said, "I have something to show you." And he pulled out an overlay for all of his components. And it turns out he was aware that at that point Mayfair had the Star Trek license, because we were doing Star Trek at the time. And so when he pitched us, became Star Trek 5-Year Mission, which is a dice game obviously themed in the Star Trek universe. In the case of Star Trek, in the case of that license, we as a company were basically said, you have 2 years, you can publish up to 9 games within this set of universes. So for example, we couldn't use the cartoon, we couldn't use the reboot, but we could use anything from Next Generation, Enterprise, any of the other series that we wanted to. So in that instance, in that particular license, yes, we were able to move right in and say, yeah, we've got 7 slots still available, you take one of them, we're good. That is very much not the case on some other licenses, especially for stuff at that point, and it depends on how hot the license is. So if you try to go into, for example, to a Yu-Gi-Oh thing right now, not only is that company going to be on the hook probably for that game specifically, but there's huge advances involved. I don't think I'm terribly out of turn by saying, for example, I think in the case of Star Trek, we had, I think, a $15,000 check we had to pony up front against future royalties to be able to step into the room to get that license. So this is not small. Basically, when you're going into a licensing situation like that, you're expecting this game is going to sell 20, 50. You're talking about a quantity of games that is significantly larger than most hobby games that are published nowadays.
Yeah.
So you have to know you've got that kind of game that can make that kind of commitment. But oftentimes, yes, if you have a game, feel free to pitch it in its generic form, but understand that, hey, you can say this is a way that it might be able to use if you have access. And that's and you think about the important stuff is that company has that license. A company that has never done a licensed game is oftentimes going to find it very daunting to try and go out and find a license for the first time. But if a company that has worked with other IP like that has experience with that, and has an active IP, then you have a little bit more of a window to be able to say, here's a game, I think this game is excellent, and could sell you 20, 40, 1,000 copies a year, and additionally, this is how you can leverage your IP that you have.
That's cool. I also, what you said about the way that particular guy pitched is very theatrical too. Like, here's a great game, and voila, it also has blah blah blah. That's cool.
He was very He was, David.
I have a slightly different take on the IP. It'll depend on the type of company who has the IP, who has all the licenses. I did some work for a company who, at the time, almost exclusively did licensed games. In that company, they had essentially a pool of designers, like a pitch pool, and each week they would send out, we've got a license for Batman, we want a game that will cost $50, plays 2 to 4 players, uses the artwork from the Batman comic books, from the 1970s to the 1960s, and, can do this. And anybody who was interested in that pitch would write off like a 1-paragraph short pitch, send it off to them. They would sort out the ones they liked. They would get a small group of pitches that they thought had potential. They would have you do a second pitch back to them on that, where you would have to have essentially most of a game designed in about 2 weeks. You would send that in. If they liked that, then you had about a month to get them a completed game. Now that's certain companies that work only by licensing and that only do that company was primarily working licensed games, and I'll say it's not the quality of the games wasn't necessarily expected to be super high. It was just expected to get a playable game with that license out the door in 2 months. And so that's a just watch for companies who do exclusively licensed type stuff and know that you're getting into a very different sort of game design.
Yeah, totally different world. Yes?
Has COVID changed this? Has COVID changed the pitching, the games you're looking for?
Yeah, COVID has moved pitching a lot more online, for sure, and I hear that from every designer I talk to. The designers I've spoken with, I work with a lot of like professional designers, and they like it mostly. It's hard to schlep to a convention every month, and then it's like
Is it
very
changing the games that they're looking for?
Oh well, certainly I've seen. It seems like more. It hasn't changed the games we're looking for. So I'm only going to speak about what I see from the outside looking in at other publishers, and maybe Alex, you can comment on this as well. It does seem like there's more solo games that are sort of being sought out. Maybe a little more emphasis on lower player counts, a little less emphasis on party games. But these are sort of speculative because I'm very much entrenched in my own company's world, and our own strategy has not been affected. What do you say to that, Alex?
I would say that there's been, I think, solo mode is something that has really become a thing in the last couple of years in particular. It was funny because back when I was with Mayfair, we were sniffing around Coffee Roaster, which got eventually published by DLP, which I thought was a brilliant game, but it was exclusively a single-player game. And I spent some brain time thinking, okay, I'm going to make this cooperative, 2-player, all that sort of thing. And although that particular game I don't think got the traction that it frankly deserved, but I guess game gets whatever it gets. That said, I think the importance of a lot of the games that have come out that at least have an automa or something that has a solo player mode to it is really important. That's a really nice selling point to offer to a publisher that you have a solo player mode. And again, it doesn't have to be the same game in a sense, because oftentimes you're either trying to beat a score or you're trying to, match a specific goal. But if you can provide that as part of your pitch, as part of the game design, if you have solo player availability, that's a plus. There's nothing but a plus there.
That's almost essential for any Kickstarter game right now, is a solo mode.
Yeah. And beyond that, I think that, yes, there has been some emphasis on lighter games, mostly because I think in a lot of cases, the play units of people have changed to an extent. Whereas, formerly you might have gone out and played with your friends at the local, coffee house or company. Now, I'm not playing with my younger brothers and sisters, I'm playing with my grandparents, I'm playing with more of a family unit situation, which means games need to be a little lighter, a little easier, more access to them. And so, yeah, those games have performed very well through this time. And whatever's performing very well, typically, you know, is what you're looking at for your next game. So
Yeah.
I certainly don't want to scare anybody off the idea that there are certainly, you know, heavier games that have come out and have been a success through this time period. But I think a lot of designers, and Amigo is one of them, has found that right now the market wants smaller, lighter games.
Yeah.
And you know, things like solo players plus being able to play over Zoom, you know, it's something that doesn't require pieces to be handed to another player. That's kind of a plus right now. A lot of the roll-in rights have that kind of, you know, where as long as everyone's got a print out of the sheet, you got a set of dice to play the game, and that's kind of a thing. So yeah, there's a little bit of, you know, I mean, games always reflect the zeitgeist of what's out there. And right now, the zeitgeist is you're not getting a bunch of people together in a room to play right now.
Right. Actually, that sort of speaks to a larger point about being customer-centric. So Alex just referred to the sort of different situations that people find themselves in the age of COVID. All I have is my family, and I can't go out as much anymore, so now I have to find something that works for them and me, even though they're not gamers and I am. So that's like a specific job. There are actually lots of specific jobs that games have to do, and I feel like a lot of designers really don't understand with that much subtlety what these different jobs are. And when you do, you can start designing to them a lot better. And that makes it easier to pitch, because you can say, like, your customer has this need, and this game was designed specifically to fit that need. It wasn't just, I designed this because I like it, right?
I think kind of building up to what Melanie is saying about smaller games, with the freight crisis, there's been a lot more kind of for myself as a publisher looking at, okay, what's a game that's a smaller profile, like we manufactured, quickly shipped without much air, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Because those really large games are very, very expensive to ship now. And so I think I would say that's a trend also.
Yeah, the price of shipping has skyrocketed, and it's affecting a lot of things. So that's something to be very aware of. Anything that can be shipped cheaply is more valuable now. We've just been told we have to wrap it up. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.